Hello everyone, it's Wills here. We're going to do a little bit of painting in the open air now, and it's one of my favourite lakes, and we're going to do a painting partly in the style of Monet. So first of all I'm going to do a sketch, and I'm going to use a Derwent sketching pencil, and I'm going to sketch the bridge part, and I'm going to decide what part of the composition I'm going to use. So the bridge is central, so I'm going to drop the bridge sort of here. I'm not going to worry too much. That's that end of the bridge, and then there is a reflection of the bridge and the actual edges of the lake. So Monet, for a lot of his life, had visibility problems, and that's why he started painting in the style that he did, showing light and reflection, because he had cataracts. He had cataracts for many years, and his visibility got worse and worse. So you all know what I'm going to say now. This is one of my old favourites, of course, wind gel. And this is a fairly thick one, and I'm going to paint the whole thing in wind gel first of all. I used a Derwent sketching pencil to give me a fairly good line to see through the gel, and it doesn't smear very much. Now Monet, he was called the father of impressionism. And that partly because of the way he painted, and he did form impressions. He liked to paint a lot in his garden, the garden of the house that he lived at. And in that garden there was a lily pond, a lily lake, and he had, I think, 15 gardeners. And he had lots of the plants and trees moved regularly so that he could make up compositions. A bit like Monty Don with paints, really. Right, so that is covered in gel. And I'm going to mix colours and sketch on. I'm not going to finish all of this outdoors, there'll be some studio work, so this will be an oil paint sketch. So these are the colours I've chosen to use on the palette, and this is a flat number 8 brush. So I'm going to, this is a sketch really, this is an oil paint sketch as I've said before, and I'm going to look at the dark and light areas. So first of all, little bits of the lake are really dark. So there's a dark green there, that's a sap green I think, yeah. And I've got this black and brown here. I'm moving around a little bit because I haven't got the thing set up the normal way, but it's for convenience really. As I said, Monet was called the father of Impressionism, and these paintings were an impression. And they were an impression partly because of his failing eyesight. So he drew and painted things that were familiar. He came to live in England for a while, lived in London. Painted a lot of scenes along the Thames. And he often did them in a misty sort of painting. Because that was how he saw a lot of things. He had cataracts for many, many years. And in those days, artists were having cataract operations. And he knew of one or two that had had failed operations, that it had completely ruined the sight. So he kept refusing to have that done. And he refused almost till the end of his life. When he finally had an operation, he realised how stupid he'd been, because he said he could see everything so clearly. But he started painting in a different style. So I'm looking at colour and tone here. Shapes in the water. Sorry, that is a relative of mine up in the tree. Shapes in the water, shapes along the edges. So we're starting now to look at the light and shade. So Monet's pictures were mostly about light and shade. And he tried to look in depth. See, the light is changing down there slightly. He tried to look in depth at what was happening, although he had this bad eyesight. So my greens are a little bit yellower than Monet used to like a sort of a bluish green. So we'll go back to a little bit of that. But that isn't really the colour that's in that water today. So I'm just stippling with the brush here. I'm using the flat of the brush, as you see. I'm trying to look at the little things growing on the edges here, And at this time of the year, we're in November, so at this time of the year a lot of things have died back and left little stumps, little sticks really of things. So I'm just putting them in very roughly. And the water lilies are died back quite a bit. That's all I'm going to worry about with those lilies at the far end there. And then there's lots of these little sticky things coming out here. Then the water clears down here. We've got to decide what we're going to do with it. Is it going to reflect the sky? I think it's going to have to. I'm afraid we'll get disturbed from time to time with, there are a lot of Wills fans out in the woods. They come to photograph me. It's one of those things that you get used to. Painting outdoors is something that everybody should try. Painting from life, painting as the light changes. You have to get in certain shapes and marks and colours. You're forced to do it by what is going on around you. And you will get disturbed by people. You will get disturbed by people who want to come up and see what you're doing. It's sometimes better not acknowledging people. Just let them nosy around and go off on their way. Lots of colour in the water at the moment. So I'm going to stop for a minute and I'm going to mix the blue for the sky and the reflection. So I've dropped a bit of blue onto this palette here, and I'm just going to take those two blues because I think that's the sky that I'm going to want. So there is some of the sky as I see it, and then slightly darker down here. So Monet was French, obviously, born in Normandy, and as I said before, they called him the father of impressionism because of the style he adopted or had to adopt. And he had a lot of followers. When he was a young man, his father, like many of the painters of the day, his father didn't approve. Wanted him to be a businessman of sorts. But he wasn't having that. His mother was his big supporter, like, again, several of the painters of the day. When his mother died, he went to live with a rich aunt. and she supported him. The house that you all see very often in Monet's paintings, the house that he lived in, he didn't own until late in life. He rented it for years and years, and loved the place. And then eventually his wife persuaded him to buy it, because he changed it all the time. He had his gardeners changing it so that he could paint different scenes. And part of that was because of his vision problems. He wanted to see different things without moving around too much. Back to colours. So a lot of Monet's paintings, or most of Monet's paintings, are quite large, but some are immense. Like Water Lilies, which remains unfinished. His paintings were immense, and museums had trouble hanging them and getting frames big enough for them. But he was always in demand, Monet. Unlike a lot of the other impressionists that didn't sell paintings, didn't sell work, people were attracted by his scenes. So, let's have a look at this bridge. Now, this part of the bridge here is both dark and pale. It isn't as dark as the parts around it, because it has a sort of an iron structure to it. And behind there, it's slightly darker. And then it goes to these dark areas here in these bushes. I'll come back to that. Exciting moment. I'm going to use red, one of my favourite brushes. You are lucky today seeing all this. I lose a bit of detail because I'm working on gel. But when this dries later in the studio, I can overpaint. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. So not as bright as I would like it, but it gives me the idea of where that bridge is in that landscape. Just look at now little marks here in, so this is the reflection of a tree here. And you see the green is very pale, and Monet did some of this. You can see his colours quite distinctly. He often outlined lily pads and things in greens and yellows, like an outline on them. to show sunlight, to show the difference between light and shade. A little bit of red. And then we've got this red, these red stipples. And they're a real mixture, so I'm going to have a lot of mixture on the brush. I'm going to scratch some shadow on here now. Not a lot of paint on the brush. So we've got this feathery sort of tree at the end here. Okay, I'm starting to get some shapes now, putting some shapes right. So we have, looking at the actual lake, we have here lily pads, and the sky is changing, and the sun is just about catching them, and it's a very strange colour. Let's just look at these lily pads. So Monet liked to repaint the same scenes through seasons to show the differences in light, shade and composition. And because of his afflictions with his sight, He used to do strange things like this. So I've got vermilion red on the brush, and he would flick around the lily pads because that's how he saw them. And very often when you see some of his paintings, when he does a large lily pad, it just looks like a big smear of pale green with maybe a yellow flicked around it, because that's how he saw them. But in actual fact, when you actually see the real lakes, that's how they look. So I'm just going to put in, I'm not going to do too much more of this. I'm going to take a couple of photos and finish this off in the studio. But we have here the base of that large tree there. This actual painting has taken me about an hour so far, and it should have been just a sketch, but the composition is quite difficult. So we have to know when to stop, and I think I'm getting near that point. So I'm getting towards the end of what I can do out here. It's getting later in the day. It looks nice and bright, but the sun is starting to go down. I'm out here in the wilds. If you have liked the picture so far, don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell notification, because you know, when you comment as well, I always answer my comments eventually. So this is all I'm going to do out here, apart from taking some photos. Just put in where the branches of this tree go, so that I can sit in the studio and complete it. It's from me, Wills. I'll see you back in the studio. We've driven a few hundred miles back to the studio, and this is what we did in the wood. And I've got a photograph here of exactly where I was standing when I did that work. So I'm going to start putting detail onto here. I'm going to mix on this palette here. So Monet liked to show impressions, and that's where impressionism came from. And one thing he liked was light against dark, showing depths and textures. But because of his bad eyesight, his brushwork looked relatively crude, but in actual fact he was very perceptive man. I'm sort of mixing paint and gel at the same time. I'm just trying to get the right shades here. He was very good with water, but he seemed to like it sunshiny, so that it was very bright. He was a very good caricaturist. He was just a very fine artist all round. He was, just as I was saying, extremely perceptive, and his bad eyesight didn't seem to take anything away from him in that respect. Now, trying to work a little bit in his style. I can't do that exactly because he was a very different person to me. So I'm going to mix actually on the canvas. Now, I've taught young people art in the past, and most young people, when they come to art lessons, feel that what they want to learn to do is cartooning. And Monet himself was inspired by Eugène Boudin, who persuaded him to stop with the caricatures and the cartoonery, go outdoors and work on plein air, out in the open air. He enjoyed that. He worked all over Europe, Monet. He worked with Boudin. They painted in Normandy together. Northern France was Monet's real favourite, but he did work in London. He took to the very strange weather conditions around the Thames. Now you can see what I'm doing here is I'm bringing in not the clouds so much but the distance, and I'm just going to put back some blue. I'm using the brush the wrong way on, instead of that way, this way. We want to show the water. Yes, he hated being away from his wife and his friends. He used to send morose letters back to his wife saying that he missed being back home and missed his garden and missed her company. But he could produce loads of work every day. He could produce 9 canvases easily on the banks of the Thames, particularly on days when the light was changing. So I'm just going to need a little bit more white here. He loved the early morning conditions when the sun was on the mists and the fog and how it changed. And instead of doing what a lot of painters do and changing his painting as the day went on, he would try and complete the canvas and then start another one. So he often ended up with loads of canvases. So later in life, Monet decided he would go for a cataract operation. He was inspired by his friends. Earlier in his life, some of his artistic friends had had cataract operations and they'd gone wrong, leading to partial blindness, and he was really worried that that could happen to him. I'm just going to change brush. I'm going from the flat, and I've just picked up this small round. It's a number 5, may not be small enough, but this blue that I've got here, put some gel into it. This is how, to him, these water lilies would look. So we're getting a little bit more like Monet now. Now I want to be bluer. I'm mixing a little bit more blue in, coming forward. The bottom of these reeds would be dark, so I'm just going to pick up another flat. I've got some black and green here. I've got a very stiff brush. Okay, let's darken that off nicely. Yes, Monet was quicker than me with his brush strokes. So he would have, because he was outdoors all the time pretty much, it was a lot easier. I need a whiter, need a bit more white in that. So these sorts of marks he would put on Probably quicker than I am putting them on. But you can see where the marks are going there. They're lily pads and marks in the water. Monet loved his garden at home, and the home that he had most of his life he didn't own, he rented. And then towards the end of his life, when he was relatively wealthy, I mean, he was a successful painter. So towards the end of his life he actually bought it. I think it belonged to an aunt. But all through the years when he worked in the gardens, he had several gardeners. And he kept them really busy. They moved plants around for him, particularly his flowering cherry tree. He had it moved dozens of times, even when it was in flower. And evidently his neighbours were really annoyed with him because he imported water lilies, and they thought it may infect their gardens. And he imported tropical fish as well, cold water fish like koi, and they were really annoyed that these things may escape into their garden areas. And to be honest, he had a great eye, and his gardeners were always busy moving lily pads around, polishing them so that they shone in the sunshine. I guess that was part of his bad vision problem, that it was easier to see them. When they were shiny. Going back to his later life, when he decided he would have the cataract operations, they were quite successful. So successful that he was able to see his paintings properly for the first time. And when he saw them, he attempted to destroy a great many of them. He thought they were nonsense. But of course they weren't nonsense, they were his impressions at the time. And that's what his impressionism was about. So he was persuaded to stop those actions and keep a lot. But it's said that he destroyed several hundred before he was finally stopped. It was said that, now I don't know whether this is even possible, but it was said that it was felt that he could actually see ultraviolet light after his cataract operations. A lot of his work was on huge canvases, and that was part of his disposition, and the fact that his vision was bad. He did these massive canvases so that he could get some sort of semblance of detail. The reflection there runs into the lily pads, so we've got to keep that in mind. Just going to use this small brush. So a bit more interest about Monet. In the top 20 impressionist paintings in the world, Monet had 15. This is in the top 20 in monetary value. So 15 of his paintings were in the top 20 in monetary value at resale. As I said before, the name Impressionism comes from Monet, and it comes from a painting called Impression of Soleil Levant. I think it means sunrise, the sun rising, and that is the original painting, and it is a rather misty impression, rather Turner-esque. We look at all the French impressionists and we forget that they were preceded to some degree by Turner, who was, if you look at his work, a bit of an impressionist. Right, so I just mixed up a light green for here. Light green for there, comes in as a reflection here. So here's this bush. This isn't dark enough, but I just want to get started on the shape of it. Trying to work in that Monet style. It's a lot bigger than that. And it goes a lot further, so it's down here. Dark green and purple can give us this effect. So there's a dark effect here. That goes down into the water down here. So Monet used these small, fast and fragmented brush strokes, which is what I'm trying to do, as you saw just here in this bush. He would pick up the idea of the shape. Too dark. And he would try and put it onto the canvas. And it doesn't always work. It's that little bit just worked then, but it doesn't always happen right. But it was his trademark, and as his sight got worse, those little brush strokes like that ran into each other in that way. Some of my favourite work of his was in that sort of period, really, because he was giving us an impression of how he saw the scene. And for those of you who visit France, Givenchy is where Monet's home, this home, not this particular home, but the home he had with the lake and the flowering cherries and the bridge is there. It's open. It is run by foundation. I believe Monet left money. Monet left money. So he showed me the money to actually help with the foundation. And French Arts run that, so people can go and visit, and it's all protected. You can go and see it just as it existed, because it is all under a protection order. So this is sort of coming together now. A little bit more Monet than when I first put paint onto it. So when Monet was a youth, if ever he was, he went to an ordinary academy, an ordinary art school in France, and he didn't like it. He didn't care for the tradition. He thought he could express himself in better ways. So he became a student of the Swiss artist Plein, who was more of a more modern artist. And when he was a student of his, he met Alfred Sisley, Auguste Renoir, and other painters of similar feeling. And they started to study how light and shade worked, like this. So the light from the sky catching the water lilies in the dark water, and here, where this one lily is highlighted by the sky, and then you see the depth of the water underneath. And that's what they worked on. Renoir was particularly good with light. Some of his work under trees in Paris and with the dappled sunlight coming through. Fantastic pieces of work. But Monet, he had his own ideas, and as I've probably said before, was called the father of Impressionism because he epitomised what that small school of artists was actually trying to do. You see, I'm using the paint that's the residue of paint in the brush because it gives me that feeling of what happens between light and shade. He was married twice, Monet. His first wife died quite young. He painted her quite a lot. I think she was a good study. She could sit well, and so he used her a lot in his paintings. And his second wife was Dutch, Alice Hochede, something like that. I think she was Dutch. Became very jealous of his first wife after her death because he hung on to those pictures that he'd done, and she tried to destroy them at one time, I believe. I don't know whether she actually succeeded. Claude Monet outlived his second wife as well, Alice, by about 15 years, I believe. He was a person who knew the value of his work, unlike many painters, particularly unlike somebody like Vincent van Gogh. Vincent never really understood the value of his work. I mean, he's, for me, a genius, and his work is invaluable, it's so good. But he never really understood any of that, whereas Monet did really, and ended up quite respectably well off through his work. Don't forget to look back through my back catalogue sometime as well. I've got a how to paint like Vincent van Gogh. I did a painting of Port Merion at night, a starry night scene in the style of Van Gogh, a scene that he couldn't have painted. And this scene here, you saw me by this lakeside actually painting in the open air. is also a lake at Port Merion. This is the Chinese lake at Port Merion. I chose it because, well, for one thing, I was there at the time. For another thing, it's the sort of scene that he would have liked to paint. And it was autumn colours as well. So some of the colours are spectacular. They'll be coming in fairly soon here. So we've got some paler. Sometimes painting is about knowing what is on your brush, because you can use it around the painting. And at the moment I've got this back in the hairs of the brush. I've got green on the brush, but in the back of the hairs I've got that pale blue, and it just gives me that impression around the bushes here that I can see in the scene. So we should never waste the paint that we've got. Now I need this sort of pinky look here. Here is the edge of this small tree. And then the reflected edge of it, which we started down here. Right, we're starting to get there now. So parts like this, to be less in the reflection than there is in the real. So we're just showing what may show in the water. So the next bit I'm going to do is here, and we've got autumn colours coming in. Now this is quite difficult to do in the Monet style because his colours tended to be, although vivid, rather muted. These colours are quite strong. So I'm going to start got a lot of gel in this colour. Okay, and then we put a bit of green into it and a bit of white. Using both sides of the brush because the colour is always different on each side. Gives a good effect. We want some dark green, put a bit of red into it. So what we have there is the beginnings of a tree, a silver birch tree. So these are the sort of strokes in his earlier life, particularly, Monet used. He worked with these short, sharp strokes. When he did things like fog and mist, he tended to swirl with his strokes as well. I think because of his vision problems, he probably wants to get the feeling in. It's not dark enough there. The feeling of the atmosphere, the shapes. For some reason there's a very vivid piece of sky in this area, so I'm going to work on that. I'm not going to entirely mix the blue. Monet was very fond of this azure blue that you get in parts of France particularly. See, I've got lots of blue on the brush. If I use the back end of the brush, I can pull the blue back in. So I put white onto the canvas and then mix it the way I want it. Okay, that's coloured the tree nicely for me. Seems to have coloured my fingers quite nicely as well. So I put the blue brush on one side, And now it's the impression of trees and some twigs, some branches that have already dropped their leaves. Not going to be quite so easy. Going to use a fine brush. Right, that's falling into place nicely. Now I've got a sort of a pinky haze here with another birch tree growing through it. I'm going to call this side of the painting finished. So I'm going to go on to this side now and finish this. But I see some small errors here where I haven't got quite the right shade of colour. So over to this side now. Okay, so I've got some shape here of bushes and trees and a particular set of light, particular piece of light that falls on it, turns it into sort of pinky grey almost, very strange colour. So first of all I'm going to try and mix that colour using the sky blue, because I think it's the sky that's causing the very strange colour effect. Let me just try this. No. No, just need a bit more red here. Oh, found a red that I haven't yet opened. Sometimes colour mixing can be quite difficult, and the impressionists took a lot of time and effort. If you're a student of impressionist painting, you have to look really deeply. Painters like Cézanne really chose their colours very well, but sometimes it doesn't seem so. Right, this is the right colour here. Good to go into the sky a little bit, and I'll bring the sky back into it here. To get this feathery effect, but I also need to bring some blue into it here. And oddly enough, the same strange blue comes right down here. So it must be a light effect. It was a day painting this in the open air when the light was very powerful. So there's a tree here that runs up into the light, this very strong light in the autumn sky, and the tree is a very powerful light green. Just got to mix some more greens up. So I'm going over to this side, and there is a lot of shadow here, and the shadow works its way up here. So the light is up here, coming from several directions. The sky is very bright, and it shows this part up here, this strange colour, but there's lots of shadow areas here. So I'm going to put the shadow in before I put the rest of the dots of colour in. Got the dark colour that I want here. A little bit more violet in that. Okay, I'm going to call that side done. And I'm going to come over to this side again to do a quick repair. So I've realised I've missed out the reflection here. I knew when I was doing it I was doing something wrong. I think we'll say that's finished. So this is a painting in the style of Monet, of one of his types of favourite subjects, It's a garden in Portmeirion, North Wales, and it's the Chinese lake. It's to show impressionism in its early stages. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Pablo here hopes you've enjoyed it. Who knows where his pants have gone, but he's very Christmassy. He'd like you to subscribe. He'd like you to ring the bell for notifications. He'd like you to like. And he'd like you to comment, please. And so would I. So I hope you all have a happy Christmas. If Christmas is all over, have a good new year. So it's goodbye from me, goodbye from Pablo, and goodbye from Monet. See you again in the studio real soon. Bye.